Hey everyone, this is Joe Massaro with Yahweh Sisterhood Book Club, and this is a place where readers get to meet authors. And we love it because not only do you get to read a book, but you actually get to talk to the author. And we are so excited tonight to have Michelle Ule with us. Welcome. This is not your first time with us.
No, but it's lovely to be here. It's always fun to talk about books with people who love books.
Oh my gosh, yeah. I have most of the people that I know, certainly in the book club and other places, just love to read. And I was captivated as a child, and I haven't stopped. So, so good to have you here. I'm just going to do a little backstory about today, Michelle. You don't mind? Michelle and I had planned to, have this discussion about her books. And I thought, because people are asking me, could you go live on Facebook, and I'm like, okay, we'll do it. And I researched it and had everything planned. And the minute I was on live, it was great because I've done that before. But the minute I had Michelle come on, I was like lost somewhere. You could barely understand me. We finished that interview, but I really felt, I was like, Lord, I really feel bad. This is not the interviews that I do. And Michelle said, I'm ready to do one again today. So in the course of today, not only did we do an interview this afternoon, but we're doing another one tonight. And this happened once before to me. And I have to tell you that the second one turned out so good. Not for the same reasons, but something else happened. And so I'm just excited. Maybe you could tell us a little bit about who you are.
Well, my name is Michelle Ule, and I live in Northern California. I'm up in Sonoma County, which is the fire area. We've had fires in 17, 18, 19, and we have a red flag warning today. So it's an exciting time and place to live. And lots of opportunity for ministry because so many people have gone through so many difficult things. I grew up in Southern California. I'm married to a retired naval officer. We've got a bunch of kids and some adorable grandchildren. And we've lived all over the United States. I have been thankful for libraries all over the United States to read and read out of, and books. And that's most of the interesting thing about me right now.
Well, you also were a reporter. Yes.
Literature from UCLA, where I was an editor of the paper. I was a reporter and editor of the paper. I also marched in the band. So my time at UCLA was very, very fast. And I graduated in 3 years. So I'm not really sure what happened in like this. But yeah, and I'm the author of 10 published books. I've just finished writing another biography, which is, right now it is actually in the editing stages with me. I haven't even read the whole thing yet. I wrote it here while we've been in shelter in place. And I just wrote it. I didn't read it. And now I'm reading it, and there's lots of work to do on it yet, but that's good.
Can you share anything about that yet, or should we wait?
Well, the book isn't sold yet, but it's a biography of Letty Kalman, who is the author of Streams in the Desert. It's sort of a follow-on, really, to my book about Biddy, a biography of Biddy. These are two biographies of two very different women. Letty is very over the top and effusive and a speaker. Biddy didn't want me to know anything about her. I'm going to have to kind of sneak in the back door of heaven and avoid her for a couple thousand years because I think she's going to be very happy with me. But I know that Oswald is going to greet me with arms wide and a big grin on his face. So I am encouraged by that. But,
I have a feeling that somebody's going to pick up that book.
We will see. So a biography of Letty Kalman. What's important about these two women, both of them, is that they were unsung heroines, really, of Christianity for the last 100 years. They both produced books that have significantly affected people's relationship with God. And their stories, because they're just such fascinating women, have been just a pleasure and an honor to write. But for me personally, opportunities to really grow spiritually. So I am very grateful that I had the opportunity to write those books, but also that I get to read them and edit them.
So when we met you the last time you were with us, we went through your book, Mrs. Oswald Chambers, and it's the woman behind the world's best-selling devotional.
Yeah, and it's right here. Here she is.
Yeah. I have to tell you, it's one of my favorite books. I just absolutely loved this book, and I just felt like my faith was increased in reading it, and I felt so close to Oswald Chambers, I call him now OC because that's what,
That's where we
yeah, I feel like he's my friend.
exactly.
He's not here with us now, but I really just felt like what a man that I would love to have just sat with and had a conversation with. And
Well,
just
when we get to heaven, I'll point you out to him.
okay. I appreciate it. I appreciate it. Okay, so the book we're really going to talk about tonight is, and I just lost the title. A Copy in Remembrance. Thank you. I just totally,
Just happen to have a copy right here.
yeah, it just happened. I absolutely love this book as well because of, Oswald Chambers is in there and Biddy is in there. But the storyline with your characters is just absolutely, absolutely amazing. I fell in love with your main character.
Yeah.
Maybe you could give us a little bit of a backdrop as to what the time frame was, and then maybe a little bit about the characters.
Well, the prompt, if you will, that I was given was to write an inspirational novel that began the day World War I began, which was August 5th, 1914. And the book ended the day the war ended, which was November 11, 1918. And so my charge was to come up with a novel that would be inspirational, but which would cover 4.5 years, a pretty large period of time. And the story I finally come up with a crazy series of events it's a coming of age story of a young American woman who begins the war on August 5th. She wants to be a journalist. She's newly moved to London. Her father is an editor, writer, a journalist for a newspaper, and her secret goal has been to prepare herself so she too could become a foreign correspondent. She comes from a newspaper family. Her grandfather owned the paper. Her father inherited the paper, and then her father lost the paper, but was able to remain on as an editor and a writer. So the war begins, and it's a coming of age story is where you see a young person grow from one period to another over a select point of time. In this case, it's 4.5 years. And she was 19 at the start of the story, and she ends at 24. And she comes of age emotionally, spiritually, and professionally over the course of the war. For that reason, the book is divided into 3 parts. We begin in England, we go to Egypt, and then we conclude on that glorious day in Paris when the war ends and the bells toll and life is glorious once more because the onslaught, the horror is over.
Yeah.
When I wrote the book, I specifically wrote it so that we as the readers are coming of age, if you will, over the course of the war as well. So the first section, which is England, we don't know anything about the war. The war has just started. And Claire, as a 19-year-old, gets into the newsroom to work with her father, but she's only seeing the war through the things he is saying, the discussions that are going on round about her. She's innocent, really, of what a war is. She was familiar with the American Civil War, and as I told you earlier, I was surprised that the American Civil War really took place only 50 years before the start of World War II or World War I. And I wanted to talk about that in regards to, we forget that. That's as far away from us as the Vietnam War is now. That seems for some of us not long ago at all. So she doesn't know anything about men. She's been at Radcliffe. She is a college girl, but blue stocking, really doesn't know much about men because she's been sequestered away. She doesn't know a whole lot about publishing other than what she knew through her family line, and she has no more spiritual acumen than a typical person who just went to the local church. So we see her grow in all 3 of those areas over the course of her time of the war, but also it gets started in England. By the time she gets to Egypt, and we'll go into why she ends up in Egypt, she is now knows a little bit more about men, knows a little bit more about writing, knows a little bit more about Christianity and God. And then by the end of the war, we as the reader ourselves have grown within those relationships that she can face and make decisions about all 3 of those. And we end the war having been there because we end up in the trenches and we see a dogfight and so forth. But, and we go through the Spanish flu as well. But we end the war in a triumphant and inspirational way. And that was the way the book was constructed. So.
And in those days, you know, her family expected her to be, you know, she went to Radcliffe, like you said, and expected
Mhm.
her, if I remember, to be a teacher, maybe. Was that it? Okay.
She
And
told him that she wanted to be a teacher, but she was really preparing herself to be a foreign correspondent. In the early 20th century, women were not correspondents. We had Nellie Bly, who was a stunt writer more than anything. And there were a few women who did go to war, but they were really sheltered. Nellie Bly was there for just a short period of time. The famous one really was Mary Reinhardt, who went on to write murder stories or mystery stories. But she went over early in the war and as a writer for a series of magazines in New York. But she had been a nurse, so she was a trained nurse married to a doctor. And she got into Belgium, within a couple of months after the war started, under the auspices of visiting hospitals. But she met the King of Belgium, and she actually got all the way to the front. I mean, she was in a tree that was disguised for snipers when they realized, oh, wait, this is a woman here. We've got to get her out before the Germans notice. So it was fun to investigate those women. There's only a handful of them. I don't even think there were a dozen women who were really correspondents. So Claire was cutting edge, but I wanted her to be in that position so as I could. She was on the front lines in the sense that she was in the middle of the news the whole time in order to both inform the reader about the war, but also to see her grow.
yeah. Now, the news at the time as well, we had talked about this earlier, you know, there
Mhm.
was this censorship in some ways that were going on. Maybe you could talk a little bit about that.
Well, the first thing that happened on August 5th when the war was declared was the British cut off the transatlantic cable. So the German propaganda machine, if you will, couldn't get their propaganda as easily around the world, particularly into the United States. And the British publications all went under major censorship. Lord Hatfield was in charge of that, or it was Northcliffe, I can't remember now. But they, all of anything that was going to be published had to go through censors who were retired Army, Navy officers, and they determined what could go and what couldn't go. And so whereas we heard a lot about German atrocities, they may or may not have been true. Claire's father, Jock, experienced correspondent, questioned a lot of that. He wanted to know both sides of the story because with journalism, people can't make a decision about what they believe to be true if they don't know what the options are, if you will, what both sides are to weigh. And the British, as well as all governments really censor, particularly war news. For example, the reason we call it the Spanish flu is not because it happened in Spain. It probably came out of the United States, but Spain was a neutral country during World War I, and they were willing to report that the flu was there. For all other governments to report anything to do with casualties in terms of health would be to expose the flanks, the armies to more danger, because then the other opposite side would know where you were vulnerable. Long answer, I'm sorry.
No, I love it. Listen, I could just sit and listen to you all day. So. Maybe for somebody who doesn't know who Oswald Chambers is, maybe you could share some things about him and also tell us how Biddy got her name, because I love that story as well.
Oswald Chambers was a well-known Bible teacher in England during the opening 15 years really of the 20th century. And he's best known for a book called My Utmost for His Highest, which is a devotional that was first published 10 years after he died. He married a woman named Gertrude Annie Hobbs, here she is, in 1910, and they opened a Bible training college in the Clapham area of London, which is the same area in which Wilberforce worked 40 years before. Biddy was a world-class, if not more, stenographer. She could take down at 250 words per minute, or twice as fast as how I'm speaking right now. So if Biddy were here, she could be finishing my sentences in paper before I even spoke them, which would be very handy. She joined Oswald at the Bible Training College and was the administrator, but she also sat in the back of the room, took down notes from every lecture he gave there at the BTC. In 1914, the school was still in session, and they began to pray about the possibility of Oswald joining the war. He finished the school year in 1915. He went to Cairo, Egypt as a YMCA secretary, chaplain, basically. Biddy and their 4-year-old daughter, well, 2-year-old daughter at the time, followed a couple months later, and they lived at a camp north of Cairo, about 8 miles north of Cairo, called Zaytun. And Zaytun was the site of the 2nd Australian Light Army Division. So that meant horses and flies and, all sorts of Australian and Kiwi soldiers. And he spoke there at the tents. He basically led a revival among the troops. And unfortunately, in November of 1917, he died. Biddy and her daughter stayed on, running the camp through the rest of the war. When she returned to England in 1919, she spent the rest of her life turning her note into what ultimately became 30 different books, all published as being by Oswald Chambers. So My Atmosphere's Highest has been in print in the lives of many people. President George Bush used to read it. Biddy eventually met Brother Andrew, and he used to smuggle it behind the Iron Curtain along with Bibles. It has been a source of inspiration and encouragement ever since. A phenomenal read that has affected my life as well.
Yeah, it's one of my devotions that I do every day. I
Mm-hmm.
absolutely love it. So tell us about Biddy and how she got her name.
Oh, I'm sorry, Biddy. So Oswald really got to know Biddy on a voyage from Liverpool to New York. She was moving to New York to become a secretary there, and he was going to the Eastern Seaboard to speak at camp meetings. Her mother, who knew Oswald through his brother's church, had written Oswald a letter and said, my daughter's going to be traveling by herself. Would you mind just kind of looking in on her? So, he was a nice guy, and of course he did. And, wait a minute. She was kind of pretty, and she understood a lot about his life, and he recognized something in her. But her name was Gertrude, which was the same name as his favorite sister. So that was presenting a problem for him as he became more and more interested in this blue-eyed young woman. And so he decided to give her a nickname. He always liked to give people nicknames. He will probably call me Troublemaker when I get there. And, you can guess or gauge what he must have seen in this young woman, because he called her beloved disciple. Yes. Well, after a while, beloved disciple, shall we take another turn around the deck? Or beloved disciple, should we have a little more tea? That became a little bit unwieldy. So he shortened it to BD, and she was known as Biddy for the rest of her life.
I just love that story.
Oh, yes.
One of the things that I found fascinating, again, is because you talk about Anzac and Gallipoli. Mm-hmm. And I just happened to finish a couple of weeks ago. It was a 6-part thing on Amazon Prime on Anzac, and it was really based upon the lives of the nurses.
Oh, yeah.
And what they went through, and how they won some of them won these awards, or not awards, medals. And it was just a powerful, powerful story.
Mm-hmm. Were they at Malta? Did they work at the hospital in Malta?
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, the VAD nurses, voluntary.
They were around other places too. Sorry.
Well, I know there were a lot in Alexandria, because some of the women who came over from the Bible Training College worked at a hospital to help the Gallipoli patients in Alexandria. Some eventually moved their way down to Cairo as well, near the pyramids, is where they were stationed at what is now Mesa, or not. It's a hotel that's there at the base of the pyramids even now in Cairo. I interrupted you, excuse me.
I'm just going to say, they were in Cairo as well, because they showed that as well. So they were stationed, they kept being moved around wherever the need was. So it was just amazing to look at it from their point of view, and to see what actually happened and what they went through. So let's talk about, this is a term that I am familiar with, because I have read different things and watched different things. White feather. Maybe you could explain what that means to everybody who's listening.
Well, the White Feather Society ran during World War I, at least, and it was a group of very determined and well-meaning women who felt that every able-bodied man should be in uniform and fighting in the war. And so they would wander the streets of London, and if they ran into a young man of fighting age who wasn't in uniform, they would hand him a white feather. In a sense, it was a shaming move. not even a sense. It really was an attempt to shame men into going to war. In the novel, A Poppy in Remembrance, Nigel felt a great deal of shame as to why he wasn't going to war, and he ultimately gave in and did enlist as an Anzac soldier. Jim, the other young man in the book, was an American, and for a variety of reasons, he was not going to join up, but he managed to collect, I think, 4 white feathers over the course of the story. Again, well-meaning, but the intentions were challenging, and it made it difficult for any man who wasn't wearing a uniform to just wander through the streets of London at the time.
Yeah. You also make reference to something that maybe a lot of people may not, some people will, but there's a lot of people who may not know the story about the Lusitania.
Oh, the Lusitania. The Lusitania, my husband was a submarine officer, so I always pay attention to submarine stories. Dead Wake, I think, is the book by Larson that's such great interest. But the Lusitania was an American ship it wasn't a British ship that came from New York across to Liverpool. And the German U-boats had warned that they would shoot. They would sink the Lusitania. In fact, they put an ad in the paper in New York before people boarded, warning that they were vulnerable to being destroyed. And the Lusitania was sunk off the coast of Ireland. I think 1916. I can't remember the exact date. No, maybe it was 15. I don't remember what year it was.
I don't remember either.
But it was a scandal, and it really made the United States think twice about entering the war. It's an interesting story about the Americans. Woodrow Wilson was an isolationist, he was an isolationist. He did not want to go into war, and he campaigned not to go into war. But as the war dragged on and on and on, the American financiers, particularly in New York, had donated or funded a lot of the British government and the French government's armaments. And it got to the point where the Zimmermann telegram, which was a telegram from a German official to the officials in Mexico City, suggesting they join the Germans in the war against the United States, and then the Germans would give them the United States when they won the war. The Zimmermann telegram is what finally bounced the United States into war in 1917. Woodrow Wilson couldn't keep them out any longer. And as a result of the United States went to war. So in A Poppy in Remembrance, the Americans don't come ashore really until 1918. General Pershing was really a hero. He refused to allow American troops to go into battle under the French leadership. He was skeptical of their soldiering abilities because the French and the British basically had just sent the men into slaughter. And Pershing wouldn't let Americans go in except under American command, and they had to be trained. But once they showed up, it was over within a couple of months. And the Germans knew that. The Germans were struggling really hard in the early part of spring 1918 to take out everybody as fast as possible before the Americans showed up. Americans came ashore looking like really strong, healthy young men, which is exactly what they were. And they made the difference. I did look into some information about reparations, just like who finally paid for the war. And the answer was the Americans did. The Germans, after the Treaty of Versailles, which actually was finished up a year ago, or 100 years ago, like yesterday. Treaty of Versailles was so crippling to the German government that they had to really escalate devalue their money. And that meant that the money the Americans had lent wasn't worth anything. And ultimately they ended up pretty much paying off the war. So the United States saved the country.
Wow. So you're talking about, you were talking about the soldiers and the impact of so many deaths. And there was also, for those that survived, a lot of what we would call today PTSD, things that they didn't, and obviously influenza was happening as well. It's fascinating when you begin to look at these things in such a different way. We are used to everything being instant today. If there's something happening, we know about it pretty much instantaneously. In those days, there was not this awareness at all. I don't believe, and correct me if I'm wrong, of the things that were happening with soldiers when they were coming back from war.
No, I don't think so. I mean, many people, including family members, won't talk about what happened to them in the war. Some men came back with shell shock. Shell shock was a real problem, of course, and that probably was PTSD, and they just didn't know how to deal with it. There is a scene about PTSD, or about shell shock at least, in Poppy, when Jock and Claire run across men who are suffering from shell shock in the hospital in Cairo, and they kind of stagger out of the hospital, and Jock just shakes his head. Why are we doing such things to such valiant men? But that's been the question of war forever. I mean,
Yes,
yeah.
yes, it does. So your research had to be absolutely incredible, and I'm gonna ask you some questions. I know we did them today, but I think they're definitely worth going over again. And research was definitely one that I was interested in. Janet McHenry, her question was, how do you know when to stop researching and just jump into the writing? So first, tell us about what your research was, how that process was, and then we can maybe look at Janet's question.
Sure. It's really wonderful if you can go to the site of these locations. So my husband and I were able to visit the Bible Training College. I stood on the steps that Oswald and Biddy and Kathleen stood on countless times. I saw their view across Clapham Common. My husband and I walked across the parklands. All of these, anything I did appeared in the book. And we walked to the station where they could catch the underground. We went over to St. Paul's, and my husband and I stood in front of the painting where Oswald and Biddy became engaged. It was just lovely. I have attended services at St. Paul. It's great. It's a terrific.
I have the chills right now. I want you to know. Thinking about it. Oh my gosh! Wow.
Yeah, so wonderful. And unfortunately, we couldn't take any pictures in St. Paul, so we don't have a picture of me standing in front of the statue. But that was really great. And then my husband and I had an opportunity to go to Paris the next weekend, and from London we went to Paris, and I said, well, gosh, if we're going to go to Paris, let's go to the Somme. So he arranged for us to take, and it was wonderful. We took an all-day tour with a bunch of New Zealanders. So I was with the same type of people whom I was writing about, and we went. The Somme is where the New Zealanders and the Australians were located, which is why we went there. And it was pouring rain, just like it always was in the trenches. My husband, a military officer, was wearing a trench coat, and like all good soldiers, I was wearing a slicker and tennis shoes and an umbrella. When we returned to Paris, the sun was out. It was a beautiful spring or fall day, I guess. And we walked from Notre Dame all the way up the Champs-Élysées. And the Rivoli and the Louvre and all the places that are mentioned in in that last section of the book where that takes place in Paris, I recorded all of them. So it was really, really wonderful to be able to do that. But, I couldn't go to Egypt. So we all went to dinner at an Egyptian restaurant in Los Angeles one year. It's just really funny. We walked in, they had hookahs outside, and it ended up being run by a bunch of Russians. But we just said, we just want Egyptian food. Feed us anything that we would have if we were dining in Cairo. And then, we talked about what it tasted like. And then I was able to write about it when it came time to describe what Egypt was like. I had a couple of friends who've been to Egypt, and I interviewed them. Who knew that all the clothes they wore actually kept them cool, because the perspiration would cool the body. So it wasn't such a bad deal that Biddy was wearing, a shirt and it would help keep them cool. So that was all great. And, one of the things I love the most about writing is when people write me letters or they send me additional information. And, the crazy things that happen. OC basically ran this revival among the Anzac troops. He and Biddy were really concerned about the spiritual state of the soldiers who came to see them. Mm-hmm. They were going to go either up the line through the desert to Jerusalem, or they would be going to the trenches of France. And it was really important that they be shared the gospel. The gospel, they needed to hear the gospel. Whatever they chose was their choice, but they needed to know that there was a God there who loved them and who knew them. So I got an email one time from another woman in Australia, who told me it was her opinion that Oswald Chambers was responsible for the end of World War I. Okay, well, that's a really interesting idea. Tell me why you think that. And she said, because he led that revival among those 2nd Australian Light Infantry horsemen. And those horsemen where the heroes of the Battle of Beersheba, and because they took the Battle of Beersheba, they marched to Jerusalem, ended the war in the south when they took Jerusalem, and that made all the difference in the war ending when it did. So I went looking at this thinking, oh, come now. But her theory was that because they had become Christians under Oswald Chambers, they rode those horses all the way in an extraordinary charge. It was the last great charge of a light brigade. And it wasn't exactly true, but it made for a good story. And I spent quite a bit of time on Battle of Beersheba. And then, Jerusalem, when the British took Jerusalem, General Allenby sent flyers over the old city, but it was a foggy day, and the people in the city could hear the planes, but they couldn't see them. And then from the sky fell these pieces of paper, and they all said, "We are coming into the city tomorrow. We want to take Jerusalem without any loss of life." Signed, Allenby. Okay, Allenby is, that's a British name, but Allah Bey, which is what it sounds like when you read it in Arabic, means son of God.
Wow.
And General Allenby marched in. He didn't ride a horse. He didn't drive a car. He marched in, and he didn't know that what it turned out to be true is that was a prophecy that had been spoken about when Jerusalem next fell. It would be because the Son of God came through the gates. All right, so that's really a pretty odd little story, but it went without anybody dying. And, there you are. God works in interesting ways. It had been in Muslim hands for 600 years at that point. So Ottoman hands, not Muslim, Ottoman hands. So great story.
You see why I like talking to this lady, okay? Because you get so much. I just absolutely love it. So
Well, I should say that I have written like 100 blog posts about Oswald, Biddy, and my atmosphere science, but I've also written close on far more than 50 blog posts about various aspects of World War I. And my Pinterest, I've got, I think, 6 different Pinterest boards on World War I. So I did all of my research, and you don't set out to become an expert on World War I, but sometimes you end up there through no fault of your own.
I was checking out your Pinterest board. I really love it.
Yeah.
It's just amazing.
Yeah,
so let's go back to Janet. When do you think, when you're researching, when do you think you're at a place where you jump in and start writing?
Well, there's 2 ways of doing it. One, you never are going to be done with research. And as you write, other things turn up that you don't expect. And I have written a book here during Shelter in Place, another biography, as I said, of Letty Cowman. I had been researching for 2 years at that point, and I just finally said, okay, I'm done. It's time to start writing. And, I can check things as I go, but I'm so familiar with my research at that point. I know where to look for stuff, and I know how to alter things. In this case, I wrote Poppy first, and then I wrote Mrs. O.C. And after I wrote Mrs. Oswald Chambers, I went back to Poppy and corrected things I didn't realize just to make sure that they were correct. Mm-hmm. But, God gives you the things that you need when you need them. And when I was writing Mrs. Oswald Chambers, I was thinking about what happened when Biddy had to come back after Oswald's death and tell their 4-year-old her father had died, and what she would do and how she would respond to things. And Kathleen said it was the only time she ever saw her mother cry. But what happened after that? The daughter was dismissed and off she went, and then Biddy had to do something. So I thought, all right, so what would she be doing? And well, I was reminded of something Elizabeth Elliot says, which is when you aren't sure what to do, you just pray and then do the next thing. So I thought, oh, that's probably what you do. And I know Oswald said that. And when I went hunting to find where he had said it, to my surprise, he had said it, he had used that line, do the next thing, in the final talk he gave at Zaytun before he died. So that concept would have been fresh in her mind when she chose to do the next thing. That didn't come from my brilliant research. That's the Holy Spirit reminding me of things. It's just like scripture. The Holy Spirit will remind you of things that you need to know. And scripture would come sometimes when I would be writing that just fit perfectly within the context of whatever I was writing about. So
that's beautiful.
Yeah.
Now, David Winters asks, how do you show the importance of history without getting into contemporary political struggles?
That's always a challenge, because when you're writing historical fiction, because you need to be careful with the turns of phrase, with the word choices that you use, and you try to put yourself in the mind of people living at that time. Certainly, I mean, Claire had never seen a Zeppelin before a Zeppelin flew over her, so she couldn't associate it with anything that you or I, 100 years later, might associate a Zeppelin with. Oh, it looks like the Goodyear blimp. No, that doesn't work. History, though, runs in parallels. I mean, those who do not study history are destined to repeat it is, a pretty valid point. And people in the past have the similar desires and strengths and weaknesses that we do. It's just they're expressed in a different context. And that's true of really any novel. My feelings would be expressed differently if I was writing a Southern novel, for example. But you do have to be careful of that. And that's where you have friends read your books and say, well, wait a minute.
Yes, that's always helpful.
Yeah.
Okay, Marion Smith asked this one.
Mm-hmm.
Do you ever feel that you are really an old soul trying to capture the best of other eras?
Well, I feel like an old soul when I'm typing on the computer and it won't do what I want it to, or I can't get technology to work. No, I don't think so. I think that, again, that history repeats itself and that people are the same. Any novel is trying to take a universal emotion and apply it to a situation that we can relate to. That's why we can respond well to a novel. And it doesn't really matter when the novel takes place if the writer is doing a good enough job on expressing the universal truths.
Mm-hmm. Okay. So here's another question. Do you have a bucket list? And if you do, is there anything left on it?
Not much. I would like to, someday, and I don't know at this point if it will ever happen, I would like to go spend a day at the Hermitage Museum in St. Petersburg and walk among the paintings. Mm. Yeah, I'd like to return to New Zealand. My family spent 2.5 weeks camping through New Zealand at Christmas a number of years ago. And it's such a beautiful place. I would love to return there. I should say that that visit to New Zealand is what made me decide to make Nigel, one of our heroes, an Anzac, a New Zealand troop. Anzac is for Australian New Zealand armies.
I should say that.
Those who don't know that, I should have explained that. When you drive through New Zealand, we were camping, as I said, all these little villages, particularly in the South Island, have a statue remembering a member of the Anzac troops from World War I. New Zealand had the highest percentage of casualties of any of the Allied forces during that war, and they paid a very high price for their contribution to the British war effort. And I wanted to honor that in the course of writing the book. So sure, I'd love to go back to New Zealand.
Okay, so what person in your life has had the most impact on you?
Well, obviously my husband has, because his career as a military officer meant I moved every 3 or 4 years for 20 years. And that impacted our lives in a great deal, of course, but a positive way. Thank you, American taxpayers. Our time in the Navy was really splendid. Hard work and difficulties and challenges, yes, but I've had the honor of knowing so many splendid people all over the United States. Every church I've been in, every library I've participated in, there have always been such people who have blessed my life in so many ways. And that's why I dedicated Mrs. Oswald Chambers to all of the people, the teachers, the Bible study leaders, the pastors who have influenced my life in such a positive way. So, yeah. No one in particular other than good old Rob.
So I guess the last question, and you've alluded to parts of this throughout the whole thing, is how has your faith impacted your life? And maybe you could share a little bit about when you first got saved, I guess, if you want to say that, or gave your life to the Lord, and how that has impacted your life since then.
I had a lot of time for reflection during this time and place. And I realized that as a child, for a variety of reasons, I was always looking for a place of belonging. Mm-hmm. Maybe we all feel that way growing up. I always kind of felt I was invisible. And when I was 15, I was invited to play volleyball at the neighbor's church. And I walked over there. I was going into high school and I needed to meet boys. The first boy I saw was a long-haired guy wearing green shirt and plaid shorts and orange socks, putting up the court. And I thought that guy is either really smart or really strange. And so I married him. He was really smart. And so I became a Christian then, or a serious believer in God. My relationship with God began then, really, and has just flourished ever since. I've been a Christian ever since I was a teenager, all the way through college and all those different moves in a lot of different churches because of our many moves. So I've attended church in a number of denominations, and it has been the backbone of my life. My goal in writing is to write books that will help people, whether they are nonfiction or fiction, recognize truths about God that are different than what they expect, but are positive as to who he is. And if I have accomplished that, then I am thankful. And, I've gotten enough letters from Mrs. Oswald Chambers that, I'm a contented woman in terms of my writing, because I can see, I've met people and heard from people whose lives have been changed for the better. And thanks be to God. I mean, that's not me. I prayed while writing these books that I would write the words he needed me to say. So.
Amen. And it shows. Maybe you could share with our listeners, you have something special for them.
Well, I appreciate you taking time to listen to our conversation. And so anyone who signs up for my newsletter, I will send you a copy of the first 3 chapters of A Poppy in Remembrance. In those first 3 chapters, you will get an idea for the setup, the story, and it ends. The 3rd chapter is where she meets Oswald and Biddy Chambers in the wild at the art museum there in London. Just sign up for my newsletter and I will be happy to send it to you. It's just a pleasure to share the stories. And I'm happy to do that. And I appreciate this opportunity to chat with you again, Joe.
Well, thank you so much. And I will make sure that I have all of your information attached to this video. And gosh, what can I say? I didn't even mention that today, that in the middle of, before we were going to get started this afternoon, that the light that I use, so that I have hopefully enough light, that broke. And it was like the first day I was using it. So.
But we persevered.
We persevered. We did. And I'm so grateful to you. I just appreciate you more than I could possibly say. And we just thank all of you for being with us tonight. And I will definitely get all the information out to you. And God bless you. And again, we are Yahweh Sisterhood Book Club. You can find us on Facebook, Yahweh Sisterhood Book Club, FW. And YahwehSisterhoodBookClub.com is our website. So thank you and God bless everybody.